Hey folks, tonight we're diving into the weird sleep habits of the Vikings, those northern European sea bandits famous for raiding monasteries, and apparently having some very specific bedtime rules. Now dim the lights, turn on the fan for some white noise, and let's enjoy this nighttime journey together. Let's kick things off with one of the strangest Viking sleep habits, which actually matches most of medieval Europe. Their sleep came in phases. Yep. Vikings didn't just crash and snooze for hours straight like most of us. Instead, they practiced what historians call first sleep and second sleep. Imagine sleeping for 4 hours, waking up in the middle of the night to do chores, plot against your enemies, then crashing again for another 4 hours. Totally normal. You're not insomniating. You're just culturally on point. First sleep usually kicked off shortly after sunset. Vikings would wrap up the evening with stories, a last meal, and some heated debates about who's on goat herding duty. Then they'd rest for a few hours, but around midnight, the time modern folks consider the ruined night, because you woke up, Vikings actually got up. What were they doing then? Oh, lots. Some kept an eye on the fire or checked the livestock. Others prayed, meditated, or sharpened weapons. This tells you all you need to know about Viking priorities. According to some lore, midnight was prime time for intimacy, romance, or not so romantic stuff, while the fire crackled and the wind howled outside. They quietly did their thing before drifting off to second sleep. This segmented sleep wasn't some random Viking quirk. It was common in pre-industrial societies, a natural rhythm tied to sunrise and sunset, not digital clocks and caffeine. Before artificial light, humans' internal clocks ran on 2 phases of night like a factory shift. But honestly, it's easy to romanticize this from a distance. Waking up in a dark, smoky longhouse with 4 other people, 2 chickens, and an axe. Probably not the peaceful Zen moment you imagine. And don't forget, it was freezing, seriously cold, in 9th century Norway. Waking at midnight wasn't about biology, but survival anxiety. So picture this. You wake up in a Viking longhouse full of smoke. It's pitch black except for dying embers. Your feet are ice cubes. Your cousin's snoring sounds like a bear choking on firewood. And you've got about an hour or 2 before crashing into second sleep. Now what? Welcome to the midnight hour. That weird waking period between first and second sleep Vikings, filled with a bunch of chores, rituals, or whatever quiet stuff they could do without waking the goat. First up, eating. With no mini fridge or midnight snack runs, Vikings kept dried meat, smoked fish, or stew leftovers handy. Midnight snacks weren't a luxury, they were practical. If you spent the evening rowing, farming, or dragging half a deer through snow, waking hungry was normal. So they'd fire up the hearth, warm a bowl, and fumble around in the dark like civilized cavemen. But food wasn't the only midnight menu item. This quiet time was often for reflection. No light pollution, noise, or smartphones. You could just sit by the fire and ponder life, death, or whether Odin was disappointed in your sword skills. Midnight became a time for private thoughts, prayers, or whispered chats. Some believed dreams from first sleep were clearer, like messages from the spirit world. Others used the time to stress about tomorrow's to-do list, which honestly makes Vikings way more relatable than you'd think. And of course, there was intimacy. Yep. Archaeological evidence and medieval texts show many couples picked midnight as their romantic hour. Makes sense. You could sit by the fire and ponder life, death, or whether Odin is disappointed in your sword skills. Midnight turns into prime time for private thoughts, prayers, or whispered conversations. Some folks believe that dreams from the first sleep are clearer, like messages straight from the spirit world. Others spent that time stressing about everything they had to do the next day, which honestly makes Vikings way more relatable than you'd think. And, of course, there was intimacy. Yep. Archaeological digs and medieval texts show plenty of couples picked midnight as their romantic hour. Makes sense? You've rested a bit. You're not totally wiped out. And honestly, the fire's roaring now. Some even say Vikings scheduled their whole baby-making calendar around this time. Yep. Vikings invented the midnight booty call. If there's one thing they knew, it's that the world doesn't stop when you're asleep. Villages got raided, cattle stolen, and enemies had this annoying habit of showing up right before dawn. So when it came to sleep, especially during war or travel, Vikings didn't just crash and hope for the best. They had shifts. Yep. Even bedtime was a tactical operation, especially on long ships or military camps. Someone was always on watch. Could be the captain, a trusty warrior, or the guy who lost at dice. But someone had to stay alert, scanning the horizon for enemy sails, or making sure the ship didn't drift into a trap. And if you think modern night shifts suck, try staying awake in freezing rain with nothing but a beard to keep warm. These shifts rotated. One group slept, the other stood guard. Then they swapped. The result, nobody got a full night's rest. But hey, nobody got killed in their sleep either. Viking compromise. Even at home, some form of night watch was common. In longhouses, the big communal rooms where everyone slept together. Someone might stay up late tending the fire, listening for wolves, or just wandering around to make sure the animals weren't chewing someone's shoes again. In bigger settlements, guards patrolled or manned watchtowers, but it wasn't just about safety. It was culture. Always being ready was a point of pride. Vikings weren't allowed to sleep like the dead. They were supposed to sleep like warriors, lightly, suspiciously. Axe in hand, deep sleep was for suckers who didn't expect a surprise attack. Sounds exhausting, and probably was, but that vigilance was part of their identity. Being a Viking meant being tough. You slept when you could. You stayed awake when you had to. And if you nodded off on watch, someone might pee in your helmet as a lesson. Picture this. It's midnight in a Viking longhouse. Frost on the window. A smoky fire in the middle. And half a dozen Norse folks curled up under rough wool blankets. Now look closer. None of them took off their clothes to sleep. No pajamas. No cozy robes. Vikings slept fully dressed, often in the same outfit they wore all day. Sometimes, they even added a special touch like armor. Let's start with the basics. Viking clothes were mostly layers wool sweaters, linen undergarments, thick cloaks, and animal pelts if they had them. This wasn't just fashion. It was survival gear. Taking off your clothes to sleep basically meant signing up for hypothermia. After all, this is Scandinavia, not some cozy Roman villa with heated floors. While sleeping in clothes wasn't totally unusual for prehistoric times, Vikings took it a step further. If you were a warrior, especially on the road or during conflict, you might sleep with some gear on you. Not full iron armor unless you were really hardcore or just couldn't get comfy otherwise. Oh yes. This isn't just about clothes. These were survival tools. If you stripped down to sleep, you were basically signing up to wake up a frozen popsicle. After all, this is Scandinavia, not some cozy Roman villa with heated floors. Sleeping in your clothes wasn't unheard of in prehistoric times. But Vikings took it up a notch. If you were a warrior, especially traveling, or during a conflict, you might sleep with a bit of gear still on you. Not full-on iron armor. Unless you were insanely tough or just hated comfort, but enough to be ready. Because, honestly, waking up to a raid wasn't 0% likely, and fumbling with your pants while some guy's stabbing your door is the fastest route to Valhalla. There are tales of warriors dozing off close to their helmets, weapons ready, cloaks still buttoned up. It's not about fashion. It's about not dying. Comfort, negotiable. Readiness, not so much. And this wasn't just a warrior thing. Even regular folks would sleep in their outdoor clothes during the winter months. The idea of putting on warm clothes after waking up is about as useful as a screen door on a submarine when you need to stay warm. Could sleep outside in their gear during winter months. The idea of putting on warm clothes after waking up, not really a winning strategy when you need to. Stay warm and keep your temp steady all night. Taking your clothes off basically means you've given up. If there's one rule the Viking culture seemed to worship, it's this: never let your blade be more than an arm's length away. Even when sleeping, especially when sleeping. For Vikings, the bed wasn't just a place to crash. It was a potential battlefield. The idea of hiding out without your weapon nearby, about as smart as forgetting your sword before a duel. So whether in a longhouse, on a boat, or camping under the stars, weapons were the trusty sidekick before bedtime cold. Sharp and oddly comforting. Archaeology and sagas show plenty of Viking men, and some women slept with their weapons. Not necessarily hugging a sword like a teddy bear, though. To be fair, some might have. Usually, weapons were tucked under furs, beside the bedroll, or even held in hand. Think safety, courtesy of sharp steel. And this wasn't about showing off. It was practical. Viking homes were often remote, vulnerable, and made of flammable wood. Raiders, rival clans, and wild animals didn't wait for dawn to attack. Waking up weaponless was a fast track to becoming an epic poem that nobody remembers how it ends. There was even a word for this mindset in Old Norse culture: vigilance. Sleeping too deeply meant sleeping carelessly. A truly respected warrior stayed alert even in dreams. If you nodded off during a raid, or worse, died in your sleep, unarmed, good luck getting into Valhalla. Odin's picky about that kind of thing, and weapons weren't stored in chests or racks. Axes leaned against walls. Swords lay right next to pillows. If you were handy, you could shove a spear under the bed frame. A well-rested Viking could switch from snoring to swinging a weapon in under 5 seconds. Sure, it came with risks: random midnight stabbings to the foot, accidental elbow cuts, but for a Viking, that beat waking up defenseless. Let's clear this up first. Ordinary Vikings didn't sleep in romantic fur blankets carved from ancient oak. That's Hollywood. The real story is, unless you were rich, noble, or at least high status, your bed was probably just an honored pile of straw. Maybe a shared bed. Definitely itchy. The upper crust. Yeah. They had decent beds. Archaeological digs found bed frames in high-status graves, decorated with intricate carvings and fancy metalwork. These were wooden box beds you see in museums or fantasy shows, partially covered to keep warm, sometimes with curtains to trap heat and, hopefully, keep snoring servants out. But for most Vikings, not so much. Commoners slept on the floor, on benches. or big wooden platforms near the hearth. Softness was relative. A pile of straw, moss, or a wool-stuffed sack if you were lucky. And some, old ship sails or sheepskin if you weren't. Comfort wasn't top priority. Warmth and survival were. And forget about private bedrooms. The longhouse was one giant shared space. Kitchen, bedroom, stable, and shelter all rolled into one. Best to build your bed against the wall. A wooden ledge where you could lie down, curl up in your fur blanket, and pretend not to notice your cousin's breath. The closer to the central fire, the better. Old folks and the sick usually got the prime spots. Kids and animals squeezed around them, making a warm human and beast sandwich. Romantic? No. Effective? Absolutely. Another issue was hygiene. Sometimes there were curtains to keep in the heat and stop the servants from snoring you awake. But for most Vikings, nope. They crashed on the floor, on benches, or big wooden platforms near the fire. Softness was a relative term. A pile of straw, moss, or a lucky wool-stuffed sack. And if you weren't so lucky, some old boat sails or sheep wool. Comfort wasn't the priority. Warmth and survival were. And don't even think about a bedroom. The longhouse was a giant shared space. Kitchen, bedroom, stable, and shelter all rolled into one. Best to build your bed into the wall, a wooden ledge where you could curl up under some animal pelts and try to ignore your cousin's breath. The closer to the central fire, the better. Elderly and sick folks got the prime spots. Kids and animals squeezed around them, creating a human-animal sandwich of warmth. Romantic? Nope. Effective? Hell yeah. Another issue was hygiene. You didn't flip your mattress every 6 months. You shook out the straw when it started smelling like goat pee and hoped the fleas only took half the bed. Still, way better than sleeping outside or on the deck with the wind howling through your clothes. Vikings weren't chasing REM cycles. They just wanted enough heat to survive the night without waking up frostbitten. If you were a modest-income Viking, meaning you didn't own land, livestock, or a suspiciously shiny axe, you probably spent most of your life sleeping on the ground. Not metaphorically. Literally, no mattress, no frame. Just you, some animal skins, and a patch of packed earth. Hopefully not soggy or goat poop covered. Literally. No mattress, no frame. Just you, some animal hide, and a firm patch of earth, hopefully not damp or covered in goat poop, inside those longhouses. Floors were usually packed dirt, sometimes sprinkled with straw to soften the blow or, more realistically, to soak up whatever spilled from the animals, soup bowls, or both. Sleeping right on the floor wasn't a sign of failure. It was just your average Viking minimalism, practical, low maintenance, and surprisingly cozy. And for the truly broke, it was the only option. No couches, no wooden bars, just animal skins laid out in a spot less likely to catch fire or get stomped by clunky hooves. There are even notes about travelers and guests crashing near the doorway, what the Vikings called a higher step outside on the hospitality ladder. Sleeping by the door meant you were welcome. Well, sort of. Also, you were probably the first to get stabbed if intruders showed up. So, you know. Perks, here's the fun part. Sleeping on the ground kept you warm. The earth holds heat surprisingly well, especially when you're sandwiched between two people and a dog. And when your worst enemy is freezing to death, you take every bit of warmth you can get. Summers were cool, but calling it comfy might be a stretch. Bearable is probably more accurate. Of course, this kind of sleeping did zero favors for your back. Back in the Viking era, there were no chiropractors. If your spine got messed up, you either walked away or became a poet, or, sadly, worse. Viking culture admired toughness and was a little suspicious of luxury. If you could sleep on the ground and still wake up ready to raid a monastery, well, you were doing pretty well. But if you're a fan of peace, privacy, and your own bedroom, you might want to skip time traveling back to Viking days. Because for most Norse folks, sleeping was a group sport, the whole family. Sometimes the extended clan, servants, guests, and occasionally animals all shared the same room, and often the same bed platform, not for fun, but to stay warm. Remember, this is medieval Scandinavia. Winters were long, cold, and brutal, and fireplaces didn't come with modern insulation. Seriously, unless you were nobility with your own box bed, privacy was a joke. You had to share whatever sleeping space was available. The closer to the fire, the better. Closer to grandma's snoring, not so much. Viking longhouses were open plan. No walls, no cozy corners. Just a fire pit in the center, and everyone packed in like sardines on either side. Beds, if they existed, were usually set into walls or along benches. Otherwise, you just picked a spot on the floor and made it work. If someone wandered into your room at night, congrats, you're now friends. Where you slept wasn't just about comfort, it showed your status. The head of the family snagged the warmest, most central spot. Kids got tossed wherever, while servants and distant cousins got the edges by the door. The dog, or the goat, woke up with a hoof smacking your face. Don't sweat it. And remember, all this happened with zero ventilation. A room packed with people, animals, smoke, stew, and the faint musk of wet wool and soggy shoes. No way you got a full night's sleep. But hey, you survived. That's the Roman problem, not the Viking one. Vikings didn't do privacy. In fact, some scholars argue that sleeping so close forged tight social bonds built around the fire, shared stories, and collective pain of hearing your uncle mumble Viking poetry in his sleep. Those bonds formed through the firelight, storytelling, and the shared agony of your uncle's Viking verse sleep rap. If sharing a bed with your in-laws sounds rough, imagine adding a goat, a cow, or 3 chickens who absolutely refuse to keep quiet. Welcome to Viking central heating, sleeping with your pets. No, this isn't some weird rural tradition. It's survival. Welcome to Viking central heating. Sleep with your pets. No, this isn't some quirky rural tradition. This was survival. The Viking longhouse was a multi-purpose masterpiece. One big room for eating, sleeping, working, storytelling, and of course, housing the animals. In fact, many longhouses were split into 2 main areas, one for humans, one for livestock, sometimes with a raised threshold between them, sometimes a wooden partition, and sometimes you just accepted that the family sheep was now your bedtime neighbor. Why? Because animals radiate heat, and in Scandinavian winters, every bit counts. A single cow could warm a corner of the house just by existing. Some cows are basically radiant heaters. Chickens, not so much less efficient, more chaotic, but still kinda useful. And animals don't just roam free inside. They have pens or stalls, at least in sturdier houses. but the sounds, smells, and occasional noises still sneak into the night's soundtrack. A gentle lullaby of hoof taps, snorts, clucks, and maybe a pig judging your dreams. Cleanliness. Well, surprise, definitely not top-notch. The floors packed dirt, straw everywhere, and the line between kitchen and barn is more of a vague suggestion. But for Viking families, that trade-off was worth it. Stay warm and live, or stay clean and die. Easy choice. Sleeping with animals wasn't weird. It meant you were doing things right. You maximized resources, kept your animals safe from thieves and frostbite, and made sure your kids didn't turn into wild Vikings overnight. And of course, kids loved it. Free heat and living pillows. What more could you want? Now, imagine you're a Viking on the move, a quick raid, a long trading trip, or a classic colonial conquest. That means one thing: you're sleeping on a boat, and Viking ships, not exactly luxury cruises. Their longships had open decks, powered by sails and rowers, designed for speed and surprise attacks on foreign shores. Comfort was not in the budget. No cabins, no hammocks, no cozy living rooms, just cold, wet planks, and maybe a pile of sails if someone was generous. Sleeping on board depended entirely on weather, waves, and guard duty. No schedule, just pure exhaustion. Row for hours, nap when you can. Sometimes you'd collapse soaked in sweat and seawater. Other times, you'd try catching Z's next to barrels of dried fish and some dude wearing a dented helmet. If it rained, you got soaked. If the wind picked up, you had to brace yourself and avoid sliding into someone's sword. And if you were lucky enough to sleep under the sails, congrats. You just hit VIP status. Crew shifts rotated constantly. Some rowed, some sailed. Some tried to steal a little rest amid creaking wood and crashing waves. It was never quiet. Never. Just sleep. Like a longer blink. And then there was the smell. Salt water, unwashed bodies, dried meat, and sheep. If you brought livestock, picture yourself drifting off with someone sharpening a blade behind you and a goat standing on your face. That's not a nightmare. That's Tuesday on a Viking ship. But Vikings weren't after comfort. They were after conquest. Sleeping on the ship wasn't for rest. It was survival during storms. You didn't need to feel refreshed. You just needed to be able to swing an axe when you hit shore. For Vikings, dreams weren't just sleep's side effect. They were messages, whispers from gods, warnings from the dead, and sometimes spiritual previews of your coming week. Viking folklore and Eddic poetry are packed with dream omens. A ship sailing west in your dream. You're about to die. A cold wind blowing through your house. Also death. Wolves roaming your village while you sleep. Definitely dead. Basically, if you wake up remembering anything, you probably should update your will and maybe skip tomorrow's raid. But not all dreams were doom and gloom. Some were visions of Odin or Freya, giving you sneak peeks at battles, harvests, or hidden treasure. A good dream could boost your status. The bad ones, well, if you're smart, you keep those to yourself. Nobody wants to be the guy on the ship ranting about drowning people in his sleep. Total buzzkill. Freya, offering insights on battles, harvests, or hidden treasure. A good dream could boost your status. Which ones were bad? Well, if you were smart, you'd keep that to yourself. Nobody wanted to be the guy on the boat bragging about seeing drowned souls in his sleep. Bad vibes all around. Vikings even had dream interpreters, thought to be spiritually in tune and able to decode your nighttime visions. They weren't therapists. They didn't care if you worried about goat taxes. They wanted symbols, ravens, fire, ice, broken swords, three-headed cows. The weirder, the better. And dreaming of the gods, that was serious business. Especially Odin seeing him in a dream could mean anything from divine favor to an impending bloodbath. If he shows up in your dream and gives advice, great. If he just stands there silent, robes flowing, then walks away, start digging your own grave, the man is. Then there's this whole sleepwalking belief that your soul might take a midnight stroll while your body's just lying there drooling. So yeah, a lot of people took sleep seriously. You're not just snoring away. You might be fighting spiritual battles in other realms while you're slobbering on your sheep pillow. Sleep wasn't just rest. It was a gateway, a vulnerability, and sometimes a divine setup. For Vikings, dreams weren't for daydreaming. They were for survival. Most folks brush their teeth, change into pajamas, maybe read a book before bed. Vikings, sometimes they threw on armor, just in case it was their last nap before meeting Odin. Not paranoia. Ritual prep for battle. On the night before a fight, raid, or any bloody business. A Viking warrior might hit the sack fully kitted out armor, helmet by the bedside, sword ready, not because he was scared, but because that was just how you rolled back then. A Viking warrior might crash fully geared up, iron armor, helmet by the bed, sword ready to go. Not because it's comfy, definitely not, but because the gods dig readiness. Dying well and ready ups your chances of getting picked by the Valkyries. Sleeping unarmed. That's like showing up to Valhalla in your underwear. Some warriors believed their pre-battle sleep decided where their soul ended up. If you're all set, alert, and battle ready, Odin notices. But if you're drooling on your fancy tunic and left your axe next door, you might just wake up in hell, the icy afterlife reserved for those who died without much heroism. Pretty rough fate for a guy bragging about owning a dozen axes. Of course, this wasn't gospel truth for everyone. Not everyone could afford armor. It was pricey. But even regular folks sometimes slept in travel gear or clutched weapons. On the night before a dangerous trip, it was a symbolic message to the gods and your crew. I'm ready. Let's roll. And it's not just about dying stylishly. Sleeping geared up had tactical perks. Ambushed. No time to change clothes. A fully armored warrior could jump up and fight in seconds. Imagine sneaking into a Viking camp only to find your target awake and battle ready. When winter sweeps into Scandinavia, it's not polite, it conquers. Snow falls like divine punishment. The sun dips. Temps plunge. Why is my beard freezing to my chest during these dark months? Viking activity slows and sleep increases. Yup. Vikings might have been the original human hibernators, not bear style, but seasonal rhythms of long rests and less hustle. In short, they slept more in winter. And who could blame them? With limited daylight, icy travel, and little farm work, waking at sunrise, which was like 10:30, was hard to justify. Winter became all about conserving energy, preserving food, and praying your supplies didn't freeze solid in February. Sleeping longer wasn't just comfy, it was smart. Less moving meant fewer calories burned, and food became precious. Why chop wood when you can layer up and snooze through the next blizzard. Families huddled indoors for days, sharing stories, warmth, and each other's company, not laziness adaptation. Extended rest helped bodies recover after months of hard work. Hunting and war. Think of it as ancient off-season training. If that training included lots of snoring and reindeer fur, so be it. Northern folklore even hints at a dream season, when people felt sluggish, reflective, and spiritually checked out from everyday life. Maybe the Norse saw winter not just as downtime, but as a mystical season where sleep, dreams, and soul-searching blended together. While some still had to herd animals, chop wood, and prep food, there was definitely a shift. Winter wasn't raid season. It was time to sleep, plan raids, and recover from the last one. Most Viking sleep habits aim to keep warm, survive, and avoid aches. But sometimes, Vikings chose not to sleep at all, not due to insomnia or weird goats. Sometimes, staying up all night was intentional, even sacred. Enter the ritual wakefulness state. Some Viking traditions involved purposely skipping sleep to honor the dead, chat with gods, or prep for a big, bloody event. For example, at funerals, mourners stayed awake all night praying, drinking, reciting poetry, and telling stories about the departed. Sometimes pulling an all-nighter was totally on purpose, even sacred, entering ritual wakefulness, if you will. Some Viking traditions involve staying up on purpose, usually to honor the dead, chat with gods, or prep for a big bloody event, like at funerals, where mourners stayed up all night praying, drinking, reciting poems, and swapping stories about the dearly departed. Think of it as a mashup of a Viking wake and a TED Talk more beer, and occasionally, axe juggling. These overnight gatherings were no casual hangouts. Staying awake was a sign of respect. Nodding off was a major no-no, like texting during a eulogy. But with a high chance of your drunk cousin waking you up, staying awake also had spiritual meaning. The Norse believed the veil between worlds thinned at night, especially when someone had just died. So staying up wasn't just social, it was sacred. Staying up meant you might actually sense the dead's presence, maybe even see a ghost or two. Sacred connection, or just too much fermented honey? Who knows? Warriors practiced staying awake before raids or big battles. Pulling an all-nighter was like mental training, time to meditate, focus, or psych yourself up by staring into a fire and imagining the epic sounds of Valhalla. Some warriors even claimed they got omens or dreams while wide awake, sitting in a trance before fighting. Then you had seers and alchemists pulling all-nighters to perform rituals, chant spells, or interpret other people's dreams. They were expected to stay disturbingly alert and calm while everyone else nodded off eating porridge. After all the legendary tales, boat raids, and wild stories, one fact about Viking sleep stands out. It wasn't luxury. It was survival. If modern folks see sleep as self-care, Vikings saw it as a battlefield. Their sleep was hard-earned. They took shifts to avoid getting ambushed, curled up by the fire with animals and kin, because insulation mattered more than privacy. They slept in their clothes, sometimes even armor, because you never knew who or what might walk through the next door. Dreams weren't random brain static. They were potential prophecies. They accepted that sleep sometimes healed the body, sometimes prepped the soul for death. Even all-night wake rituals at funerals or battle watches reinforced the idea that sleep wasn't guaranteed, and definitely not something to take lightly. For the Norse, every moment of rest had a purpose. Sometimes that purpose was warmth, sometimes readiness, and sometimes just proving you're tougher than the night itself. Comforting, right? That's the story after the raid, after the snow melts, and after you've made it home on both feet. Maybe. Then you'd get a bed, probably still shared, maybe next to a goat, but despite all that, Viking sleep was anything but dreary. It was resilient. They adapted to their brutal world with plain practicality and a pinch of mysticism. They didn't invent bedtime stories, but they sure knew how to turn dreams into legends. And maybe that's the most Viking thing of all. They didn't romanticize sleep. They didn't overthink it. They just did what needed doing. Wrapped in wool, clutching axes, snoring under ramshackle roofs while the wind howled and the world waited for spring. In 1480, Rome was a city of incense and blood. Behind the crumbling empire's glorious columns, a new dynasty was rising, not an emperor, but a pope ruling like a lord. And on April 18th, Lucrezia Borgia was born into this world. Her father, Rodrigo Borgia, a Spanish cardinal with ambitions that required spilling blood. Her mother, Venata de Catane, a Roman with connections and cunning. From the start, Lucrezia's life was soaked in silk and scandal. She wasn't your average illegitimate child. She was the illegitimate daughter of a man who'd later become Pope Alexander VI, considered one of the most controversial popes in history. Dynasty doesn't even cover the Borgia family. They basically trademarked the word. Rodrigo Borgia didn't hide his kids. Nope. He flaunted them, throwing them into courts and marriages like chess pieces. Pawns in a game where the Pope held all the power. Lucrezia grew up under Vatican protection, educated, fluent in Latin, Greek, and poetry. Pawns on a chessboard, pieces in a game where the Pope held all the power. Lucretia grew up under Vatican wings, schooled, fluent in Latin, Greek, and poetry. Her childhood wasn't just toys. It came with tutors, political gossip, and secret ceremonies. She wasn't naive. She was raised to charm alliances. By age 11, rumors started swirling, not just about her being a girl, but about her being a weapon, a tool of beauty and manipulation, trained to marry the highest bidder or the most strategic family. Her father didn't see her as a kid, but as a key, a path to influence across Italy's fragmented city-states. But then things got complicated. Was Lucretia a cunning witch from the start? Influence across the fragmented city-states of Italy. But here's where it gets messy. Was Lucretia a scheming witch from the start, or just a girl lured by a rotten family? Shoved down the only path her notorious last name paved for her. As Lucretia hit her teens, her world got darker. Rome was a playground of poison, spies, and hidden daggers. The Borgia name became a symbol of seduction and betrayal, and Lucretia was probably the oldest and most misunderstood icon of them all. No throne, no army, but beauty. And in Renaissance Italy, beauty could be just as lethal as any sword. At just 13, Lucretia Borgia was draped in gold-trimmed silk and stood before the altar, where a man waited for her, Giovanni Schwartz, Lord of Pizarro, 27 years old, twice her age. This marriage, not about love, just cold, hard convenience. The Schwartz family ruled northern Italy, and Pope Alexander VI wanted an alliance to protect himself. Lucretia, his daughter, was the bricklayer in this master plan. The wedding was a spectacle, fireworks, processions, Roman nobles pretending not to whisper behind intricately painted fans. But behind the party was extreme tension. Giovanni Forza had noble blood, but not enough juice to be truly valuable. Worse, He started looking like dead weight, completely ignored. Meanwhile, Lucia tried to play the part. As a teen, she was said to be charming, modest, and super devout. She spoke politely, often quoting psalms, and seemed to genuinely like her new husband. But feelings, totally irrelevant to the Borgia machine. Within 4 years, Giovanni's worth evaporated. By 1497, the political winds shifted. Pope Borgia no longer needed the Schwartz family, and Giovanni, once praised, became a burden. So the plan kicked in. Lucretia was sent to a convent to rest, behind the scenes. Pope Alexander VI canceled the marriage, claiming Giovanni was impotent. Giovanni was humiliated and furious. So he fought back with his only weapon scandal. He accused the Pope of wanting to end the marriage just to keep Lucretia for himself. Whispers exploded. There were incest rumors between father and daughter, and between Lucretia and her brother Cesare. Rome was flooded with filthy stories, too scandalous to say out loud, but too juicy to ignore. At just 17, Lucretia was the center of it all, not the villain, but a symbol. Was she the temptress corrupting everyone from the papal throne down, or just a victim of a system that used her and then threw her under the bus? When the annulment was finalized, Lucretia's reputation started to crumble, not because she did anything, but just because she existed. The Borgia name now screamed poison, lust, and betrayal. And Lucretia, she was just beginning to realize how truly trapped she was. Lucretia Borgia walked out of her first marriage not broken, but dangerous. She survived political betrayal, public humiliation, and incest rumors. But like every chapter in her life, the next one would be darker, more complicated, and downright baffling. Right after her marriage to Giovanni was annulled, Lucretia retreated to a convent. But this time, it wasn't just for show. During her quiet time, a mysterious scandal exploded. In 1498, a child was born, a boy registered in Vatican records under such weird circumstances that historians still argue about it. The Vatican files are so strange that even scholars can't agree on what really happened. The kid's name was Giovanni, and there were two totally opposite papal decrees about him. One claimed he was the son of Cesare Borgia, Lucretia's brutal and ambitious brother. Another, stamped Secretissimo, that's Vatican for top secret, claimed the boy was Pope Alexander's own son. No documents ever mention Lucretia as the mother, but the timing, her disappearance, and the rumors made it clear. The Vatican records are so weird here that historians still argue over the truth. The child's name was Giovanni, with two conflicting papal decrees showing up. One claimed he was the son of Cesare Borgia, Lucretia's ruthless and ambitious older brother. Another, marked Secretissimo, top secret, claimed the boy was Pope Alexander's own son. No document said Lucretia was the mother, but timing, her disappearance, and rumors said otherwise. Everyone believed the kid was hers. So who was the father? Cesare the Pope, a secret lover named Pedro Calderon, a Spanish courtier who mysteriously vanished, probably thanks to Cesare. The truth got tangled in lies and missing documents. But one thing's clear: Lucretia's body was always the center of scandal. She couldn't even sneeze without Rome thinking it was part of a Borgia conspiracy. If the kid was hers, she never officially admitted it, but she didn't deny him either. Giovanni would be raised in the papal court first as an illegitimate child, then as a grandson, became the talk of the town. She couldn't sneeze without Rome suspecting it was some calculated Borgia plot. If the kid was hers, she never officially claimed it, but she didn't exactly deny him either. Giovanni was raised in the papal court. First, an illegitimate child, then a grandson, and finally a pawn in the family alliance. Lucia kept walking like nothing was wrong, smiling through the storms and refusing to explain. This era sealed her legend. Lucretia, the beautiful poison goddess. Lucretia, the seductive incestuous. Lucretia, the spider queen at the center of the Pope's web. Who cares about the lack of proof truth lost to legend? But instead of hiding in shame, she was gearing up for her next gig, a new marriage, a more valuable alliance. And this time, the stakes weren't just political. They were life or death. Lucretia wasn't playing porn star anymore. She was becoming a queen in a cruel twist of fate. Lucretia's second marriage gave her something she'd never known before: love. In 1498, at just 18, she married Alonso of Aragon, Duke of Bischlier, a handsome 19-year-old with soft manners from the royal family of Naples. Unlike her first hubby, Alonso held no political power, just a prince with royal blood. Surprisingly, their marriage seemed warm, even affectionate, for a while. Lucretia blossomed. The whole court buzzed about her beauty: golden hair, pale skin, eyes that could flip from innocent to mischievous in a blink. She and Alonso were seen holding hands, strolling through the Vatican gardens. In 1499, she gave birth to a son named Rodrigo, after her father. Pope Alexander VI? It should have been a fresh start. But this was the Borgia court. Love didn't last long. Power ruined it. Cesare Borgia, Lucretia's brother, now a glory-obsessed lord, had just married a French princess and allied with France. Naples, Alonso's home, became a political liability. Cesare's ambitions needed fewer ties, and Alonso was one of those ties. The knives started spinning. Alonso sensed danger and tried to flee Rome, but got caught. Then came the attack. One July night in 1500, assassins ambushed him on the Vatican steps. He was stabbed multiple times, but survived. At first, Lucretia was terrified and personally cared for him. She sat by his bedside, bandaging with trembling hands and whispering prayers all night. For weeks, she nursed him back from the brink while enemies lurked just outside the door. Then on August 18th, while she was out, a masked man entered Alonso's room. He was strangled in bed, probably on Cesare's orders. Lucretia returned to find him dead, the body already gone. Her grief was raw and public. She locked herself away for days, refusing food or conversation. The bright-eyed young bride became a widow and a warning sign. The message was clear in the Borgia family: feelings are weaknesses, and survival means knowing when to shut your heart's door. Lucretia grew colder, wiser, and way more dangerous. She stopped believing in love. She believed in alliances, and her next marriage would be the greatest and deadliest yet. In 1501, just months after Alonso's assassination, Lucretia Borgia once again donned noble silk and headed north. This time to marry Alfonso d'Este, heir to the powerful Duchy of Ferrara. A brilliant strategic move. If the Borgias linked up with one of Italy's most prestigious noble families, they'd stop being seen as upstarts from Spain. They'd be legit Italian royalty. But the d'Este family was skeptical. Alfonso d'Este didn't want to marry a woman from a family steeped in poison, scandal, and incest. His sharp sister, Isabella d'Este, openly called Lucrezia a... Even Ferrara's ambassadors warned the Duke not to accept this Roman woman, but Pope Alexander II sweetened the deal with money, land, and military promises. So, the reluctant marriage went ahead. Lucrezia arrived in Ferrara in 1502 like a queen from another world. Rome was chaos and corruption. Ferrara was refined and steeped in heritage. Here, the nobility prided themselves on court etiquette, learning, and dignity. Lucrezia knew she was under a microscope. Every gesture, word, and outfit scrutinized. But she didn't flinch. She adapted fast, wearing simple dresses, throwing elegant parties, and earning praise for her charm and brains. The Ferrara court was initially frosty, but gradually thawed out. Her beauty unquestionable. But more importantly, she brought a weird kind of charm, a mix of brains, grace, and the tough-as-nails vibe she'd sharpened in Vatican politics. Lucrezia also started crafting a new image. No longer just the seductive Vatican lady. She rebranded as an art patron, a loving wife, and most importantly, a duchess worthy of the d'Este name. Her court attracted poets, artists, and scholars. She funded churches and hospitals. She carried the calm elegance of someone who's seen way too much and learned how to survive. Even though her marriage to Alonso d'Este was political, they found a rhythm more respectful than passionate, but definitely real. Alonso admired her diplomatic skills. She admired his strength. Together, they raised many kids, but even as Lucrezia settled into her new role, the shadows of Rome never fully left her. While her dad was still pope and her brother Cesare was conquering Italian cities, the Borgia legacy haunted her every step. Ferrara might have offered peace, but Lucrezia knew better than to trust that. In Ferrara's grand halls, Lucrezia played the beautiful duchess, but her heart stayed locked on Rome, where the mighty Borgia dynasty was starting to crumble. In 1503, her world flipped upside down. Her dad, Pope Alexander VI, who raised her like a daughter and used her as a political pawn, suddenly fell ill right after a party. Within days, he was dead. His body swelled, blackened, and oozed foul-smelling liquid. Rumors spread faster than wildfire. Some whispered he was poisoned maybe by Cesare himself in a failed plot. Others said the devil came to claim a soul too wicked for heaven or hell, whatever the truth. His death marked the end of the Borgia era. Lucrezia received the news with a mix of sadness and relief. But she knew what it meant. The chain holding her enemies broke. Worse, her brother, Cesare, once the terror of the Italian peninsula, was now sick, weakened by syphilis, and quickly losing power. The new pope didn't even care about the Borgias, and Cesare's enemies gathered to take him down. In Rome, the Borgia palace was ransacked, loyal allies executed, streets once cheering now cold and hostile. Cesare couldn't hold on to what he had and fled, only to be captured. For a brief moment, the fearsome Borgia family vanished from the map, and Lucrezia did the unthinkable. She stayed silent. She didn't fight to save her family. She didn't rush south to help Cesare. She shut Ferrara's doors and focused inward. Many called it betrayal, but she knew survival meant keeping distance. Her power now didn't come from the Borgias, but from being a true Este Duchess. The past was poison. The future had to be clean. Still, she mourned quietly. Letters reveal a woman torn between worlds, grieving her father and brother while fearing their legacy might threaten her children's future. After her family's fall, Lucrezia had to choose, cling to the ashes or build anew. She chose the latter. She was no longer the Pope's daughter. She aimed to be a duchess who outlived her name. After the Borgia dynasty collapsed and Rome plunged into chaos, Lucrezia Borgia began the most dramatic makeover of all, not as the infamous queen, but as the queen of culture, no longer tied to the Vatican. Lucrezia focused on building a different kind of court in northern Italy. She invited humanists, poets, theologians, and artists to Ferrara, turning the duchy into a shining Renaissance beacon of ideas. Her living room became legendary, a place where philosophy, music, and politics mixed with elegance and a dash of rebellion. She became an art patron, commissioning paintings, writing plays, and composing poetry herself. Among those orbiting her were Ariosto and Pomponio, two men who immortalized her intellect and beauty in timeless poems. Pomponio, in particular, loved her deeply. Ariosto and Pomponio, two men who immortalized her intellect and beauty in unforgettable poems, especially Pomponio, who loved her deeply. Their letters brimmed with desire and literary flair, showing Lucrezia's curiosity, emotional complexity, and mad skills at keeping control. The public saw the polished image, but behind the art and elegance was a woman still wrestling with a deadly royal court. Life in Ferrara wasn't exactly a walk in the park. Some nobles whispered she was a witch in disguise. Others were mad about her influence over Duke Alfonso. But Lucrezia had a perfect diplomatic comeback for all that disdain. She played the charity game smartly, backed religious causes, threw lavish festivals to win over the common folk. Becoming a mom turned into her new full-time gig. Winning the people's hearts became a priority. She had plenty of kids, though not all made it past toddlerhood, and doted on them like a pro, into their education and futures. She was especially protective of her eldest son, Rodrigo, whose birth date caused quite the scandal. In Ferrara, she worked to secure his status with titles and affection, even though he was a constant awkward reminder of her past life. Most notably, Lucrezia used her position to broker peace between rival factions in Italy. She wrote to kings and popes with peace proposals and de-escalation plans. Some even started seeing her not just as an ex-papal daughter, but a real ruler. By 1510, Lucrezia Borgia was no longer the only survivor. She had nailed it as a duchess, a mother, a patron, and maybe finally a self-made woman. But peace in Renaissance Italy, that was just a brief daydream, and the shadows of her past never really left. While the golden glow of Ferrara's Renaissance palace shimmered inside Lucrezia's private world, darkness crept back in, quietly and relentlessly. After her cultural triumphs, tragedy hit her family like a slow, suffocating tide. Her beloved son, Rodrigo, born from her marriage with Alonso of Aragon, died in 1512 at just 13. The boy was her pride, proof that love once bloomed in her turbulent life. His death shattered her. Friends wrote about her retreat from court. Her bright presence faded. Her joy disappeared. She wore mourning clothes for months, and her letters darkened, carrying a fatal tone. But that was just the start. She lost many children young, tiny souls barely breathing before vanishing into prayer books and tombstones. Each loss drained her body, weighed down her spirit, yet she endured, hiding her pain behind the calm mask of a duchess. She smiled at festivals for the public. Privately, she confessed to torment, guilt, and fear. Then came the persistent whispers, stories of her past, poisoned chalices, incest accusations, secret children that never really left her alone. No matter how many chapels she built or artists she sponsored, there were always Borger mutterings with narrowed eyes. Her attempts at redemption were like trying to erase ink from parchment. The stains wouldn't go away. Even her once-adored marriage to Alonso d'Este, which some called romantic, grew tense. Alonso was often away on military campaigns, and Lucrezia got more into religion and mysticism. She frequently fasted, commissioned sacred art, and threw money at monasteries. Some said she was trying to atone for sins she never confessed. Others believed she was gearing up for something darker. Her health, already battered by many pregnancies and stress, began to fail. She suffered from fever, exhaustion, and depression. By 1518, even climbing stairs was a struggle. But through it all, she kept writing, mediating, and protecting her children while preserving the splendor of the Ferrara court. As if she knew her time was running out and wanted to leave behind something beautiful, something that could outshine the scandals. But history is a jealous recorder, and with Lucrezia Borgia, the final chapter was already written. In the winter of 1519, Lucrezia lay in bed, pale and exhausted, her strength fading with every breath. She was only 39, but her body bore the weight of over a dozen pregnancies, years in court, and the relentless shadow of her family's reputation. She was only 39, but her body was a war zone of over a dozen pregnancies, years of palace drama, and the heavy shadow of her family's notorious rep. She fell ill after giving birth to her last child, a baby girl who died within hours. The brutal labor and infection came fast. The best doctors in Ferrara threw up their hands, but the Duchess seemed to already sense her fate. Her letters turned sad and somber. She'd entrusted her soul to heaven. She begged for prayers, not pity. On June 24th, 1519, Lucrezia Borgia passed away. Ferrara was heartbroken. Bells rang all over the duchy. Monasteries held prayer vigils. Courtiers wept. The woman once despised as the Vatican snake was now mourned as a noble, wise, and compassionate duchess. Alfonso d'Este, usually distant, was genuinely crushed. Her kids, especially the grown ones, felt the loss deeply. Rome remembered Lucrezia in her youth, the girl caught in a whirlpool of power plays, scandals, and poison rumors. Flyers and gossip revived old tales she seduced cardinals, offed her husband, and slept with her brother. Who cared that most of this was political slander? The Borgia brand had been stained for ages, and she took that baggage to the grave. But here's a quieter truth. Lucrezia wasn't a schemer. She was a survivor. A girl traded like poker chips by powerful men who eventually learned to shape their own courts, culture, and legacies. A woman who turned scandal into strategy, disgrace into dignity. She left poems, letters, buildings, little fragments scattered across the Italian Renaissance. And over time, historians started to rethink her story. villain, victim, or both. Maybe she was something rare, a woman living in a time with zero room for her complexity. In that way, Lucrezia Borgia became more than the Pope's daughter. She became a mirror reflecting the sins, fears, and brilliance of an era that still hasn't completely forgiven her for surviving. Richard Plantagenet was born on September 8, 1157 in Oxford, into a world swimming with power grabs and dynasty dreams. His dad was King Henry II, the first Plantagenet king, a ruler with scary energy and legal genius. His mom, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was a political storm in human form, once Queen of France, then Queen of England, and forever a force to be reckoned with. From birth, Richard wasn't raised to be English. He was raised to be powerful, not in the foggy English lands, but in sun-drenched Aquitaine, his mom's southern French turf. There, he didn't just learn the language and chivalry of the region, he soaked up pride and knightly culture. He preferred Occitan over English, and always called himself a French duke, not an English prince. Unlike his brother, Henry, the young king, Richard wasn't pampered with fancy ceremonies. He was taught how to command armies. At 12, he trained with knights. By 15, he was fully armored, jousting, and studying Julius Caesar's campaigns. Tall, charismatic, fearless, this guy clearly wasn't born to sit on the throne. He was told to capture enemies. But Richard's childhood was drowned in family betrayals. His dad's paranoia, his mom's ambitions, and fierce sibling rivalry, a toxic cocktail of loyalty and rebellion. At 16, he joined a rebellion against his own dad, led by his mom and brother. They claimed Henry refused to hand over power, titles, and lands. Bold and dangerous move, fresh out of the cradle. Richard dived headfirst into a war not against foreign foes, but his own bloodline. The rebellion failed. Eleanor got locked up. Richard had to kneel and beg his dad for forgiveness, but Henry saw something in him: fire, guts, skill. He pardoned him, but stayed tired and wary. Growing up, Richard tasted both rebellion and redemption. He learned the throne is never peacefully inherited. Thrones are carved with blood, strategy, and fear. And Richard was just getting started after the failed rebellion. Richard got control of Aquitaine, his mom's ancestral duchy. But Aquitaine wasn't a prize. It was a boiling pot of noble uprisings, hostile barons, and towns that hardly respected English rule, a toxic cocktail of loyalty and rebellion. In 1173, when Richard was just 16, he jumped into a rebellion against his own dad, led by his mom and older brother. They claimed Henry was refusing to hand over power, titles, and lands. Bold move. Richard, barely out of toddler years, dove headfirst, not into war against a foreign enemy, but against his own blood. The rebellion failed. Elena got jailed. Richard had to kneel before his dad and beg for forgiveness. But Henry saw something in him: fire, guts, skill. He forgave him, but with a tired sigh. As Richard grew up, he tasted both rebellion and redemption. He learned thrones aren't peacefully inherited. They're forged in blood, strategy, and fear. And Richard was just getting started. After the failed rebellion against his dad, Richard got control of Aquitaine, his mother's ancestral duchy. But Aquitaine wasn't a prize. It was a boiling pot of noble uprisings, hostile barons, and towns that barely, respected English crown power, and Richard, still just a guy, was expected to rule it. Instead, he conquered it. From 1173 to 1189, Richard transformed from rebellious prince to tough warlord. He crushed rebels, besieged rebel castles, and, personally, led his knights into savage battles. Dude was ruthless. Any city that defied him got torched. Castles got built. Any noble dumb enough to rebel got exiled or executed. He ruled Aquitaine not with charm, but with an iron fist. Here, he earned the legendary nickname, Coeur de Lion, Heart of the Lion. His courage was undeniable. He led every attack on horseback, fought one-on-one, and was rumored to be the strongest knight around in his court. His ferocity on the battlefield became legendary, but so did his temper and vanity. Richard never forgot his wounds, ruling not as a fair king, but as a fearsome warrior. His family ties only got worse during these years. He and his brothers, Geoffrey and John, were constantly fighting for their father's approval and land. And Henry II, seeing Richard's growing ambition, got nervous. Civil war nearly broke out several times. Then, in 1183, fate took a sharp turn. Henry, the young king, Richard's brother, and supposed heir to the English throne, died in a political dispute while campaigning. Suddenly, Richard was next in line, but Henry II didn't trust him and tried to force Richard to hand over Aquitaine to their youngest brother, John. Richard said no. Tensions flared again. In 1187, Eleanor, still imprisoned, was briefly released to patch things up. But the final break came in 1189 when Richard did the unthinkable. He teamed up with King Philip II of France, his dad's enemy, together. They attacked Henry's lands in France. The old king, weak, sick, and betrayed by his own favorite son, finally broke down when Henry died soon after. Richard became King of England, Duke of Normandy, and Count of Anjou. But his crown wasn't forged in Westminster. It was forged in rebellion, fire, and the shattered heart of a broken father. When Richard retook the throne in 1189, people cheered. He was 31 tall, blonde, and already a living legend. But they had no idea what they'd really gotten. Richard didn't care about ruling. Taxes, justice, domestic policy. Not his thing. He saw England not as home, but as a bank. Because Richard had an obsession, the crusade he'd sworn to join years before. Inspired by tales of Jerusalem's fall and the rising fame of Saladin, the great Muslim leader who'd retaken the holy city. To Richard, this wasn't just a war. It was his sacred mission, a chance to prove he was not just a king, but a holy warrior, God's chosen champion. So, he sold everything not nailed down, drained the royal treasury, imposed massive taxes, famously flogged off lands, titles, and offices, even claiming he'd sell London if he could find a buyer. He even ransomed prisoners and pardoned criminals for cash. All the money went to ships, siege engines, and mercenaries. In less than a year, he turned England into a launching pad for a crusade. Meanwhile, England itself was left behind. Richard appointed a government while away. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was regent. And his ambitious but shady brother John got very little real power. Everyone hoped Richard would come home soon. Spoiler, he didn't. In 1190, he set off on the Third Crusade, sailing with King Philip of France, his former ally turned bitter rival. They stopped in Sicily, where Richard immediately got dragged into local power struggles. Instead of praying in fancy churches or fasting in holy silence, he besieged and looted the city of Messina. Negotiations. Not his style. He was there to conquer. This was classic Richard. Show up, threaten, fight, and demand surrender. And it worked. Messina surrendered. Gold flowed into his treasury. But as his fleet set sail again, his rep as the most dangerous knight in Christendom took a hit. Cracks started to show. His alliance with Philip began to crumble, and storms soon scattered his fleet. Farther east, Saladin waited, ready to test the legend of the Lionheart. Philip was falling apart, and storms were about to wreck his fleet. Further east, Saladin waited, ready to test the legend of the Lionheart. Before Richard could reach the Holy Land, fate threw him onto a different battlefield. A storm smashed his fleet across the Mediterranean, and one of the ships carrying his sister Joan and his future bride, the Baroness of Navarre, wrecked on Cyprus. The local ruler, Isaac Komnenos, a treacherous Byzantine prince, made a deadly mistake. He refused to release Richard's royal passengers and plundered the survivors. That was the one thing the Lionheart couldn't stand. Richard stormed ashore on Cyprus, furious beyond belief. Within days, he conquered the island. It was a swift, brutal campaign. The castle fell. Isaac was captured and chained in silver because Richard promised not to use iron. Everyone was stunned. The Crusader king hadn't even reached the Holy Land yet, and already added an island to his empire. Amid this chaos, Richard did something unexpected. He got married. On May 12th, 1191, Richard married Berengaria of Navarre in Limassol, Cyprus. The wedding was ridiculously lavish. The church draped in silk, nobles and knights watching on. But the marriage was cold from the start. Berengaria was quiet, devout, and politically useful. But she never won Richard's heart. In fact, she'd spend most of their married life far away from him. This whole chapter, storm, conquest, and wedding, perfectly captures Richard's personality. He could flip from crusader to conqueror to coach in just a month. Always bold, always dramatic, always craving action. But while Cyprus fell to him, his alliance with Philip of France crumbled. Philip grew jealous of Richard's fame, charm, and probably his ability to outshine him in every way. Tensions peaked when Richard refused to marry Alice, Philip's sister, whom he'd been betrothed to for years, but then ditched. Humiliated, Philip went back to France, leaving Richard alone to face Saladin, and Richard didn't mind. He actually preferred it that way. No rivals, no politics, just war. After conquering Cyprus and safely marrying his bride, Richard finally sailed his fleet to the Levantine coast. Lionheart had reached the Holy Land, and the real fight was about to begin. When Richard arrived in the Holy Land in June 1191, the siege of Acre had dragged on for nearly 2 years. The Crusader forces surrounded the coastal city, but Saladin's defenders held strong. The crusade was stalled, morale was tanking, and sickness was running rampant in the camps. What they needed was a leader to break the deadlock, and Richard stepped up. despite scurvy and fever. He immediately took command. With siege towers, crossbowmen, and terrifying discipline, he launched relentless attacks. Within a month, Acre had fallen. The Muslim defenders surrendered, and the city gates creaked open. But the real drama kicked in after the surrender. Richard demanded a huge ransom, 200,000 gold dinars release of Christian prisoners, and the return of the True Cross, a sacred relic taken in the bloody battle of Hattin. Saladin hesitated. Negotiations dragged on. Richard's patience ran out. On August 20th, 1191, he ordered the execution of 700 Muslim prisoners, including women and children. They were dragged out from the walls and slaughtered right before Saladin's army. The message was crystal clear. Nobody wanted to mess with Richard. He acted. He didn't negotiate. The massacre shocked the entire Holy Land. The Crusader soldiers were stunned. Saladin, famed for his chivalry, was furious but didn't retaliate with equal brutality. He kept treating captured Christians kindly, probably to contrast with bloodthirsty Lionheart. The horror at Acre set the tone for the rest of Richard's campaign. He was both hero and terror. To Christian knights, he was the medieval ideal, fearless, pious, and relentless. To Muslims, he was a monster in human armor. Despite this stain, Richard's military genius was undeniable. After Acre, he reorganized the Crusader forces, revived their flagging spirits, and marched south toward Jaffa, aiming to threaten Jerusalem itself. But Jerusalem wasn't just a military target. It was a symbol. While Richard scored wins on the ground, he was slowly losing a bigger war, a war of distance, loyalty, and time. Because back in England and France, his enemies had started making moves, and the longer he stayed in the East, the more complicated things got. His crown was getting more and more fragile, but Richard couldn't care less. Right now, Lionheart needed blood, and to reclaim the Holy Land, with Acre behind him and the road to Jerusalem wide open, Richard's crusade looked unstoppable. Victory came fast. He won. At the Battle of Ars in September 1191, he crushed Saladin's elite troops with some seriously impressive tactics. While most Crusader leaders would have folded under a desert ambush, Richard adapted, flanked, and counterattacked with scary precision. His battlefield command was almost supernatural. He inspired loyalty, fear, and awe all at once. By winter, the Crusader army could see Jerusalem. But Richard hesitated. Taking Jerusalem wasn't just about muscle. It was logistics, supply lines, and weather. The rainy season turned roads into mud rivers, making siege tools utterly useless. Worse, Saladin's forces were watching every move, waiting for a slip-up. But Richard's doubts ran deeper. He knew, even if he took the city, he couldn't hold it. The Crusader states were too divided, their allies too flaky, and Richard had zero plans to stick around the Holy Land forever. Without reinforcements, Jerusalem would quickly fall back to the Muslims once he left. For a guy obsessed with lasting glory, a fleeting conquest just wouldn't cut it. So, in early 1192, Richard turned back. It shocked his soldiers. They'd marched for years, spilled tons of blood, and got so close to Christianity's most sacred city only to retreat. Richard claimed it was strategy. Others whispered cowardice, exhaustion, or maybe a rare humble moment. Either way, Jerusalem stayed in Muslim hands, but the campaign wasn't over yet. Richard retook Jaffa in July 1192 with another bold assault, personally leading a last-minute counterattack to save the city. Saladin was supposedly impressed by his guts and called him the Man of Iron. Still, both leaders were burned out. By September, they agreed to the Treaty of Jaffa. Jerusalem remained under Saladin's control, but Christian pilgrims were free to visit. The Crusader states kept a thin strip of coastline, not a win, but not a total loss either. Richard didn't reclaim the Holy City, but he kept Christianity influential in the region. But as he headed home by ship, a new enemy waited. Not Saladin, Europe itself. Because while Richard was fighting for Christendom, his own brother was fighting for his crown. Richard the Lionheart could never go straight home from the Holy Land. In fact, he barely made it back at all. At the end of 1192, he started the long journey back to England. But storms, sickness, and political enemies turned it into a nightmare. Sailing through the Adriatic, Richard was forced ashore and tried to sneak through Central Europe disguised as a humble pilgrim. Didn't work. He was caught by spies of Duke Leopold of Austria, the same guy who humiliated Richard during the Crusade by tearing down his banner from Acre's walls. Near Vienna, Leopold held a grudge, arrested the king, and handed him over to Emperor Henry VI, the sixth ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. Richard, the warrior king of England, the lion of the Crusades, was now a prisoner in a cold German dungeon. The news shocked Europe. Kings weren't supposed to be treated like this, unless they were about to be executed. But Henry VI saw an opportunity. He demanded a huge ransom, 150,000 marks, twice England's annual income, to pay up. Every church, village, and noble estate was drained dry. England groaned under the tax burden, and even the royal crown took a hit. Back in England, the real danger wasn't the ransom. It was Prince John, Richard's brother, who schemed with King Philip of France to grab the throne. John spread rumors that Richard was dead and made moves to seize power, capturing castles, forging alliances, and bribing officials. England teetered on the brink of civil war. But Eleanor of Aquitaine drained. England groaned under heavy taxes, and even the royal crown was scandalous. Back in England, the real threat wasn't ransom. It was Prince John, Richard's brother, who conspired with King Philip of France to snatch the throne. John spread rumors that Richard was dead and pulling power plays, storming castles, making shady alliances, and bribing officials. England was hanging on the edge of civil war, but Eleanor of Aquitaine, the badass mother of Richard, moved fast. She rallied loyal nobles, negotiated with the emperor, and kept John in check. When the ransom was finally paid, and Richard was released in February 1194, the guy walked free to cheers. When asked what he'd do with John, Richard joked, "I forgive him and let him wait for my inheritance." Classic Richard the Lionheart, sharp, sarcastic, and full of grudges under that charming exterior, even though he spent only 6 months in England during his reign. People saw him as a heroic king, returning like some biblical figure, but Richard wasn't back for peace. He came home to fight France. The Crusades were over. Now, the battlefield was his own backyard. Richard returned to England a free man. Sure, but he had zero plans to stay. Just weeks after being released, he crossed the English Channel again, this time not to reclaim the Holy Land, but to defend his French territory from his old enemy, King Philip II of France. Two former allies in the Crusades had now become mortal enemies, while Richard was jailed. Philip had teamed up with Prince John, grabbing castles and stirring up rebellions all over Normandy. Anjou and Aquitaine imprisoned, seizing castles, and inciting uprisings across Normandy. Anjou and Aquitaine, Richard, humiliated and furious, charged back in from 1194 to 1199. War ravaged the Plantagenet and Capetian kingdoms. Richard launched relentless sieges, raids, and ambushes all over France. He personally led knights into battle, stormed enemy fortresses, and rebuilt castles at a breakneck pace. His pride and joy was Chateau Gaillard, a massive fortress on a cliff over the Seine in Normandy. So tough and modern it was considered untouchable. He poured all his talent into it, calling it my beautiful daughter, and bragging he could hold it even if the walls were made of butter. This was Richard at his sharpest and strongest, no longer chasing after dusty Jerusalem relics. He was on a personal mission to reclaim his family's lands and punish any king who dared challenge him. Reclaim the lands his father ruled and teach those cheeky kings a lesson. Meanwhile, his brother John had humbled himself, made peace, and swore loyalty to Richard. But Lionheart wasn't just fighting France. He was racing against time. Years of war, imprisonment, and crusades had aged him. He was feverish and worn out, but never gave up. In public, he laughed, rode horses, and drank like a champ. He was weakening, and he knew it. Still, the battles raged on. Early 1199, while besieging a small rebel fortress at Chalus-Chabrol in central France. Early 1199, besieging a tiny rebel fortress at Chalus-Chabrol, strategically insignificant. Really, Richard, ever the bold one, took off his helmet and rode up to the wall to check defenses himself. From that wall, an arrow flew out. It struck his shoulder. The wound looked minor at first, but a few days later, infection set in. Richard got a fever, and his skin turned black. The Lionheart had survived crusades, captivity, and countless battles. But this wound, caused by some nameless teenage boy defending a forgotten castle, would be his last. As the infection spread, Richard the Lionheart lay dying in the chapel of Chalus-Chabrol Castle. He was only 41, a warrior at his peak, defeated not by a mighty army or legendary foe, but by a crossbow bolt from a teenager guarding a measly fortress. The irony is huge. After years surviving sieges, crusades, and imperial prisons, Richard's reign ended with a tiny rebellion in some backwater part of France, the perfect ending for a king whose life was all about defying logic and order, knowing death was near. Richard prepared himself and summoned his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, now in her 70s, to his side in one of their last talks. She held his hand like a mother, comforting her steel-forged son, now melting away. He'd made peace with his brother John, naming him heir a decision that would haunt England for years to come. And the kid who shot him, Richard spared him and even rewarded him. But after Richard died, his mercenaries ignored orders and flayed the boy alive, a brutal end to a bloody dynasty. On April 6th, 1199, Richard died. His body was divided as much in death as in life. His heart was buried in Rouen, his brain in Poitiers, and the rest laid to rest at Fontevraud Abbey beside his father, Henry II, the king he once rebelled against and eventually succeeded. He was laid to rest at Fontevraud Abbey beside his dad, Henry II, the same guy he once rebelled against, and then somehow inherited from, even in death. He stood firm over the fractured lands of a crumbling empire. Richard's reign lasted just 10 years, and he spent less than half that time in England. He barely spoke English, jacked up taxes, and left the kingdom drowning in debt. Yet, somehow, people remember him instantly as a hero. Why? Because Richard was the poster child for medieval kingship bravery, knightly spirit, strength, and stubborn willpower. The legend of him grew bigger and bigger, pumped up by chroniclers and poets who painted him not as the flawed man he was, but as the man he needed to be. Centuries later, his tomb became legendary, and his name a symbol of courage. Richard the Lionheart wasn't a saint, but he died exactly how he lived, sword drawn, heart ablaze, charging headfirst into fire, and it all kicked off with a single woman. On a blistering July morning in 1518, in the bustling medieval city of Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophäa stepped into the street and started dancing. Not to music, not at a festival. She wasn't drunk or celebrating. She just began moving to some invisible beat, non-stop. No smiles, no chatting. Witnesses say she looked miserable, arms flailing, sweat dripping down her face, her shoes pounding the stones as she spun and twitched with insane energy. Neighbors watched, confused. Some laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. But the joke wasn't over. She danced for hours, through the night, into the next day. Nobody could stop her. Her husband begged, clergy observed, doctors scratched their heads. Still, she danced on, eyes wide, body trembling, feet blistered. Eventually, she collapsed from exhaustion, only to get up and keep dancing. By day 3, a small crowd gathered, not to watch, but to join in. Like something contagious had taken hold of the town's mind. Within a week, dozens had joined her. Men, women, even kids, all spinning, hopping, convulsing uncontrollably. Strasbourg Square had turned from market to panic dance floor. No music, no fun, just bodies moving. City leaders were stunned. This wasn't a party. These people weren't celebrating. They were suffering. Some foamed at the mouth. Others screamed prayers mid-spin. Many begged for help, but no one could stop them. And worse, no one understood why. Was it a curse, a disease, or something stranger? Instead of isolating the dancers, the city council took the opposite tack. They encouraged more dancing, thinking the dancers would recover if they just danced it out. They hired musicians, opened halls, even built stages. What happened next was chaos. The crowd swelled to nearly 100 dancers. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others had strokes or heart attacks, and the dance went on. The people of Strasbourg had never seen anything like it. They were witnessing a city possessed not by demons or disease, but by something nameless, unexplainable, and merciless. Whatever started with Frau Trophäa was just getting warmed up. By week 2, Strasbourg was no longer a normal medieval city. Bakers, blacksmiths, Merchants stopped work just to watch the bizarre procession. In the town square, dancers kept popping up, sometimes in small groups, sometimes solo, and none of them could explain what was happening. When asked, they cried. Some said it felt like invisible hands forced their limbs to move. Others claimed their minds were trapped, forced to watch their bodies perform a painful, endless ballet. By now, local authorities were panicking. Over 100 people caught in this madness, some bruised and bleeding. Others collapsed and were carried away, only to return hours later, bandaged feet still dancing. This weird illness, people were crying. Some claimed an invisible hand forced their limbs to move. Others said their minds were stuck watching their own bodies pull off a painful, endless ballet. By then, local authorities were freaking out. Over 100 people got caught up in this madness. Some ended up bruised and bleeding. Others collapsed, got carried off, only to come back hours later with bandaged legs, still dancing. This bizarre illness showed no signs of cooling down. Doctors back then, yeah, they didn't really help. The top medical theory was hot blood, according to their science. An overheated heart could cause overactive, manic movements. The cure: let the body wear itself out. So, in a chillingly ironic twist, city officials hired professional musicians and dancers. They built a wooden stage in the square and pitched tents to shade the dancers. They desperately hoped the solution was more dancing. Spoiler alert, it was a disaster. The music only fueled the frenzy. Drummers blasted rhythms echoing through the streets, like war signals. Violinists played until their fingers screamed. The dancers multiplied and got wilder. Some writhed on the ground like they were possessed. Others danced so hard they dislocated joints or smashed their heads against nearby walls. By week 3, people started dying. Reports of heart attacks, strokes, exhaustion, even folks dropping dead mid-spin, only to be trampled by the still dancing crowd. No mass graves, no ceremonies for the fallen, just more music, more sweat, more misery. Behind the horror, city leaders whispered about supernatural causes. Some believed these dancers were cursed by Saint Vitus, patron saint of epilepsy and madness. Others suspected demonic possession, or worse, a divine punishment for a secret sin smoldering inside Strasbourg. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just some random woman dancing in the street anymore. This was an unprecedented public crisis with no end in sight, and the people kept dancing. They spun themselves into unconsciousness and death. While all the usual fixes failed, stages, music, and dance only fanned the flames. The people of Strasbourg turned to the only institution that could make sense of this madness, the church. By August 1518, a month into the outbreak, local clergy declared it a spiritual disaster. Medical theories about hot blood were tossed aside. They said this was no physical illness, but a soul sickness. The popular theory, these dancers were victims of Saint Vitus's curse. According to medieval belief, Saint Vitus, a 4th century Christian martyr, had the power to punish sinners with uncontrollable movement. Anyone who angered him through vanity, blasphemy, or secret sins could be seized by convulsions, shaking, and violent spasms in time with the rhythm. This wasn't a new idea. Similar dancing plagues had popped up before in places like Aachen and Metz. but never on this scale or with this level of horror. The church's solution: pilgrimage and hardcore repentance. City priests ordered the dancers expelled from Strasbourg. Many were carted half unconscious to the St. Vitus shrine in nearby Savin, carried in wheelbarrows or on the backs of pack animals upon arrival. The afflicted donned red shoes, each painted with a cross on the sole. They were marched in ritual circles around the shrine, prayed over, sprinkled with holy water, and offered gifts before the saints' relics. Some were said to recover. Others collapsed and had to be left behind. Back in Strasbourg, the church ordered spiritual cleansing across the city. Gambling was banned. Blasphemy could be fined. Secular music was outlawed. Public dancing was forbidden. Sermons thundered from pulpits, warning of God's wrath. People were urged to confess, do charity work, and resist temptation. The city fell silent and fearful, as if trying to hide the noise and madness engulfing it. And slowly, almost inexplicably, the dancing stopped. No one declared it over. No final waltz, just fewer dancers each day. Silence returned to the square. Then, as suddenly as it began, the streets of Strasbourg stood still again. But the questions were just beginning. When the last dance ended, Strasbourg didn't breathe a sigh of relief. It held its breath because no one understood what had just happened. No invading army, no natural disaster, no clear enemy. Yet hundreds had danced non-stop, some until their hearts gave out. The city returned to normal life, but the summer's memory haunted dancing non-stop. Some people danced until their hearts literally gave out. The city got back to normal life, but the memory of that summer still haunted everyone. Years passed, but whispers remained. What if it came back? What if the curse was just sleeping, not gone? Centuries later, historians and psychologists started digging deep into the records. One theory seemed to fit the madness mass psychogenic illness, aka mass hysteria. Mass hysteria happens when a group under extreme psychological stress starts showing symptoms with no physical cause. In modern terms, it's the mind taking over the body, spreading like wildfire through the community. Think fainting spells at a school dorm, or creepy contagious illnesses at a tight-knit workplace. But in medieval Strasbourg, it could take the form of a deadly dance marathon. This theory makes sense if you consider the pressure cooker situation in 1518. The area was ravaged by famine, plague, and social chaos. People were starving. Dozens of kids had recently died from crop failures. Politically and religiously, everything was falling apart. The Protestant Reformation was looming, and fear of hell was at an all-time high. Add in beliefs in curses, saints, and divine punishment, and you've got a society teetering on the edge of meltdown. So when Frau Trophea started dancing, people didn't just see a woman, they saw a warning. And their already traumatized minds followed her lead. Supporters of the hysteria theory point to similar outbreaks, nun groups barking like dogs, towns convinced invisible animals bit them, villages where laughter or screams spread like a virus. In every case, no toxins, no infections, just shared belief and shared fear. But even mass hysteria can't explain everything. Why did some people dance themselves to total exhaustion? Why did only certain towns experience this madness while others under the same pressure didn't. It may offer a framework, but it's not the full story. Because no matter how logical it sounds, Strasbourg in 1518 didn't follow logic. It followed rhythm and madness. For those who don't buy the mass hysteria explanation, another theory popped up, rooted more in biology than psychology. Maybe the dancing plague wasn't about fear or superstition, but poison, specifically a fungal toxin called ergot. Ergot is a parasitic fungus that grows on rye and other grains during warm, damp summers. And yes, that's exactly what happened in Strasbourg in 1518. When eaten, it produces an alkaloid toxin that can cause vivid hallucinations, convulsions, muscle spasms, and a creepy sensation like ants crawling under your skin. Chemically, it's similar to LSD, a hallucinogenic drug synthesized centuries later. This toxin, very common in medieval Europe, was often called Saint Anthony's fire because victims felt burning in their hands and feet. So, was ergot-contaminated bread the culprit behind the plague at first glance? It seems plausible. Symptoms like twitching limbs, hallucinations, and loss of control match the descriptions of the Strasbourg dancers. The idea that an entire community accidentally ate poisoned grain and then started moving erratically in unison sounds reasonable, especially in a time when food shortages meant even moldy bread wasn't wasted. But this theory has its flaws. For one, ergot usually causes spasms and rigidity, not dancing. Victims are more likely to suffer seizures or convulsions, not keep up rhythmic movement for days on end. Plus, ergot poisoning tends to cause paleness and vomiting before any energetic behavior kicks in. There were no reports of blue-black limbs, bloody vomit, or typical ergot symptoms in Strasbourg. Then there's geography. If ergoted bread was the cause, why didn't neighboring towns using the same grain have similar outbreaks? Why was it so specific to Strasbourg still? Some researchers stick to this hypothesis. Mild ergot poisoning may cause neurological symptoms in a community already on the brink of starvation and terror. Maybe the fungus lowered inhibitions. Maybe it blurred the lines between vision and reality, igniting a psychological wildfire. It's an intriguing idea, a poison in everyday bread acting as the chemical spark for communal madness. But like all dancing plague theories, it's missing one thing: certainty. Neurological symptoms in a community already pushed to the brink by famine and fear. Maybe the mold lowered inhibitions. Maybe it blurred the line between visions and reality, setting the stage for a psychological wildfire. It's a tempting idea, a poison in everyday bread acting as a chemical spark for community madness. But like all dancing plague theories, it misses one thing: proof, because whatever tainted Strasbourg that summer, mold or mind, it hit with the force of something older, more primal, and it didn't stop at the bread. To really get the dancing plague, we have to step inside the heads of those who lived through it. And that means entering a world where fear, faith, and folklore blended with reality in ways we barely understand. In 1518, Europe wasn't just battling famine and disease. It was also wrestling with spiritual anxiety. Life was short, violent, and often utterly baffling. Regular folks believed their suffering wasn't caused by germs or mental health issues, but by divine punishment or some supernatural rage. The church ruled every part of life. People prayed to saints for rain, fertility, healing, and especially for protection. But with that devotion came fear. If saints could heal, they could also curse. And nobody scared people more than Saint Vitus in that department. He was the saint most linked to uncontrollable movements and seizures. Stories about Saint Vitus's dance have been passed down since medieval times. Tales told of people cursed by him, dancing uncontrollably until they collapsed. Folks believed he could possess bodies, turn them into spasms, dragging the sinners into a frenzy until they were purified or dead. So when Fra Troffa kicked off his weird performance on the street, the people of Strasbourg didn't care much about science. They turned to saints and stories, and folklore filled in the rest. By then, rumors about spiritual contagion were spreading. People believed seeing someone cursed could spread the curse, a sort of medieval psychological infection. If someone got hit, and their community feared the same fate, a chain reaction could happen, especially in an emotionally fragile crowd. They might not have danced because they were physically forced, but because their minds, soaked in myth and superstition, convinced them it was happening. This belief was strong enough to override the body's natural limits. From this angle, the dance wasn't just a symptom of fear. It was fear itself. Even the city's solution pilgrimage to St. Vitus's shrine was soaked in that mindset. People thought that by reenacting rituals, wearing red shoes, and tossing coins, they could lift the curse. And sometimes, it seemed to work. But if belief could heal, it could also harm. In 1518, belief wasn't optional anymore. It was the lens through which every cough, shadow, and spasm was interpreted. And when belief breaks free from reason, reality follows. The dancing plague in Strasbourg wasn't a one-off. Actually, it was the most notorious. Across medieval Europe, similar outbreaks were recorded decades, even centuries before. This phenomenon had a name long before 1518. They called it the Cororreum. One of the earliest known events happened in Aachen in 1374, over a century before Strasbourg. Back then, rumors said crowds danced in the streets for days. They screamed, hallucinated, and claimed they couldn't control their limbs. Like Strasbourg, clergy blamed divine punishment, leading sufferers to churches for healing rituals. Then came Metz, Cologne, Utrecht. Every city had its own version. Here's what happened. Groups danced, laughing, crying, often begging for help. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others foamed at the mouth. Authorities always reacted the same way: pray harder. Take them to the nearest shrine, then hope it stops. The fact Strasbourg wasn't unique only deepened the mystery. What power could cross generations and regions, keeping that bizarre dance alive? Some scholars say these outbreaks followed a pattern. Places under stress: war, plague, famine were more vulnerable. War, disease, and famine made people more likely to get hit. And interestingly, victims were often poor, devout, and lacking secular education. Their worldview offered few tools to explain suffering, so they danced, convulsed, and screamed. Some even suggest it was a form of cultural rebellion, a powerless people expressing pain in the only language they had: spectacle. In a society where opposing the church or ruling class could get you killed, a mysterious illness was probably the safest way to shout out loud. Of course, No single theory fits all. Some cases were suspected poisoning, others mass panic, some confused with epilepsy or nervous disorders. But the common thread was how people treated it not as a disease, but as a moral and spiritual crisis. Strasbourg is just the worst case, the best documented, but definitely not the first and probably not the last. It's ancient history. Right. We're way too modern to even consider that stuff. But when fear spreads faster than facts, history loves to hit rewind. Nowadays, the idea of hundreds of people dancing themselves to death sounds like a tall tale, some dark fairy tale from a forgotten age. But here's the kicker: human brains aren't all that different from back then. And historians and psychologists keep asking, could it happen again? Some say it already has. The 20th and 21st centuries have their own versions of mass psychosis, kind of like Strasbourg's weird dance plague. In 1962, at a boarding school in Tanganyika, now Tanzania, a mysterious laughing fit took over dozens of students. Not exactly a fun giggle, more like forced, uncontrollable, lasting days. The school had to shut down. No sickness, no meds, no poison, just straight up social contagion. More recently, in 2006, at a New York high school, many girls started twitching, convulsing, and going full rage mode. Panic exploded. Parents blamed everything from environmental toxins to mold, vaccines, you name it. But after months of digging, doctors said it was collective psychosis, maybe triggered by stress, trauma, or heck, even social media vibes. Modern epidemics might not look like Strasbourg's wild dancers, but the mechanics pretty much the same: extreme stress, shared belief, and bodies flipping out for no clear reason. What Strasbourg teaches us isn't just that medieval minds were fragile, but that all minds are fragile. When systems crumble and power feels shaky, our brains hunt for escape valves. Sometimes it's panic, sometimes illness, sometimes panic, sometimes illness, sometimes dancing. Today's danger isn't a cobblestone square. It's the digital one. Online fear spreads in a blink. Fake news runs faster than medieval rumors. One viral video, one lie, one moment of mob panic before anyone can stop it. So, while we might never see villagers dropping dead from dancing in a church square again, Strasbourg's psychology still hits home. Just wait for the right stage, the right crowd, and the right spark. When it happens, the rhythm might sound a bit different, but that madness will feel hauntingly familiar. Centuries have passed since Strasbourg's cobblestones echoed with desperate dancers' footsteps. No more stages built, no musicians called. Yet, so many questions remain. Why did they dance? Was it madness? A blood disease? Or the rage of some forgotten saint? The 1518 dance plague gives no clear answers, hiding somewhere between history and myth, science and superstition. It wasn't war. It wasn't plague, rats, fleas, or fire. It was something way scarier: the collapse of human control. A city watching its people lose control over their own bodies. Not just one person, but whole groups, voluntarily powerless. There are records, parish notes, city council decrees, eyewitness tales. But all are fragments seen through the lens of an era where saints and devils were everyday vocabulary. We try to explain it with modern logic, throwing in theories like mass hysteria or ergot poisoning, but doing that risks blurring the freaky truth of what really went down. Maybe the real horror wasn't people dancing uncontrollably. but believing they had no other choice. And maybe we still carry that fear today. Just think how panic spreads now, and fear with it. One scream in a crowd can start a stampede. One headline can crash a market. A well-timed illusion can drag a whole population into a downward spiral. Maybe we're still vulnerable, not to St. Vitus, but invisible forces of belief, stress, and contagion. Strasbourg isn't just a historical oddity, it's a mirror. In the summer of 1518, the dancing finally stopped. No trumpets, no last dancer to mark the end, just silence. People went back to normal. Bakers baked, churches reopened, markets buzzed, but not much else changed. The square where they danced still stands, now quiet. Tourists pass by, clueless what once happened there. It happened right under our noses. Even fewer folks really get that. But every now and then, someone remembers, and in that moment, you can almost hear the echo of footsteps, the whispers of the crowd, the sound of a violin playing for absolutely no one.